Distinguished viewers, the Arctic is no longer a distant frontier. It has become the front line of a new geopolitical contest, and Canada finds itself at the center of it. On January 10, 2026, United States President Donald Trump declared that America would do something on Greenland whether they like it or not. This was not the first time Trump has threatened to take control of the Danish territory, but it was the most explicit. The White House confirmed that military force remains an option for acquiring Greenland. A statement that sent shockwaves through NATO and triggered warnings from Denmark that such action would mean everything stops, including the transatlantic alliance itself. For Canada, this is not a distant crisis. Greenland sits directly across Baffin Bay from Nunavut. The Arctic archipelago that Trump covets borders Canadian territory, and the logic that justifies seizing Greenland could just as easily justify encroaching on Canadian Arctic sovereignty. Let us understand what is actually happening here. Trump's fixation on Greenland is not new, but his willingness to threaten military action represents a dangerous escalation. He claims that Greenland is strategically vital to American national security, pointing to Russian and Chinese activities in the Arctic region. He argues that if the United States does not take Greenland, then Russia or China will. He dismisses Denmark's sovereignty over the territory and has suggested negotiating directly with Greenland's 56,000 residents, reportedly discussing payments ranging from $10,000 to $100,000 per person to convince them to secede from Denmark. This is not statecraft. This is attempted bribery wrapped in the language of security. And it reveals a fundamental contempt for international law, sovereignty, and the rights of Indigenous peoples who have inhabited Greenland for thousands of years. The strategic importance of Greenland is real, but Trump's framing is deliberately misleading. Greenland's position between the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic makes it crucial for monitoring shipping lanes, submarine movements, and potential missile trajectories. The territory sits astride the GIUK Gap, a naval choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom that links the Arctic to the Atlantic Ocean. As Arctic ice melts due to climate change, new shipping routes are opening that could substantially reduce travel time between Asia and Europe compared to traditional routes through the Suez Canal. Greenland also contains vast untapped reserves of critical minerals and rare earth elements that are vital for emerging technologies, including wind turbines, electric vehicles, energy storage systems, and national security applications. These resources have attracted intense interest from China, which currently dominates the global market for rare earth minerals. All of this is true, but none of it justifies military annexation of a NATO ally's territory. Here is what Trump will not acknowledge. The United States already has a significant military presence in Greenland through Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base. This installation in northwestern Greenland houses approximately 150 US service members permanently, down from around 6,000 during the Cold War era. The base operates early warning systems that monitor for Russian ballistic missiles, maintains an active airfield, and hosts the world's northernmost deepwater port. The United States has used this base for decades under a defense agreement with Denmark that allows Washington to maintain military operations on Greenlandic territory. In other words, America already has what it needs for Arctic security without owning Greenland. What Trump wants is not security. It is control. Control over resources, control over shipping lanes, control over a vast Arctic territory that would extend American dominance across the entire northern polar region. For Canada, the implications are profound and immediate. If the United States feels entitled to take Greenland by force or coercion, what prevents similar logic from being applied to Canadian Arctic territory? The Northwest Passage, which connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Canadian Arctic waters, has been a point of dispute for decades. Canada considers these waters to be internal Canadian waters under our sovereignty. The United States has consistently claimed they are international waters open to free navigation. This disagreement has been managed diplomatically for years, but Trump's willingness to use force to acquire Arctic territory fundamentally changes the equation. If Trump can threaten Denmark, a NATO ally with whom the United States has maintained strong relations for over 70 years, then no Arctic nation can assume that their sovereignty is secure. Canada's response to this crisis has been strategic, measured, and decisive. Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen on January 6th in Paris. where both leaders were attending Coalition of the Willing talks on Ukraine security. Frederickson thanked Carney for his clear statements defending national sovereignty and emphasized that Canada and Denmark must work together to secure the Arctic region. Carney made the point explicitly. We are partners in NATO. It is a mutual defense alliance. We can provide that security. This was not empty rhetoric. It was a direct message to Trump that Canada and Denmark stand together, that Arctic security can be achieved through alliance cooperation rather than unilateral American dominance, and that attempts to divide NATO allies will not succeed. Carney has backed these words with concrete action. Canada announced that Governor General Mary Simon, who is of Inuk descent, and Foreign Minister Anita Anand will visit Greenland in early February to open a consulate in Nuuk. This visit carries enormous symbolic and strategic weight. It demonstrates Indigenous solidarity between Canadian Inuit and Greenlandic Inuit communities. It signals that Canada recognizes Greenland as a sovereign partner whose future should be determined by Greenlandic people, not by external powers. And it positions Canada as a champion of Arctic sovereignty at precisely the moment when that sovereignty is under threat. This is diplomacy executed with precision. Canada is showing Greenland that it has alternatives to both Danish control and American annexation. We are building relationships that strengthen Arctic cooperation while respecting the self-determination of Indigenous peoples who have the greatest stake in the region's future. Beyond diplomacy, Canada is investing in Arctic infrastructure and defense capabilities at an unprecedented scale. In Prime Minister Carney's inaugural budget, Ottawa committed $1 billion Canadian over 4 years to improve dual-use infrastructure across the Arctic. This includes airports, seaports, and all-season roads that serve both civilian and military purposes. These investments are not merely symbolic. They address a fundamental vulnerability in Canada's Arctic posture. For decades, Canada has had vast Arctic territory, but limited ability to project power or maintain presence across that territory. Roads are limited, air facilities are minimal, naval capacity is constrained. This infrastructure gap has made it easier for foreign powers to operate in Canadian Arctic waters and airspace without effective challenge. Carney's infrastructure plan directly addresses this weakness by creating the logistical foundation needed to assert sovereignty in practice, not just in principle. Defense spending is also being transformed. Canada has pledged to increase military spending from less than 2% of GDP to 5% over the coming years. This is not a modest adjustment. It is a fundamental reorientation of our national priorities, driven by recognition that the security environment has changed. Part of this spending will focus specifically on Arctic capabilities. The federal government announced in March 2024 that Arctic operational support hubs would be built in Iqaluit, Inuvik, and Yellowknife at a total cost of $2.67 billion over 20 years. These hubs will enable year-round military operations across the Canadian Arctic, provide logistic support for northern patrols, and demonstrate sustained Canadian presence in regions where that presence has historically been sporadic. Additionally, Canada is creating a new reservist army, 300,000 strong, a force designed to provide rapid response capability and territorial defense in an era where conventional military threats may emerge with little warning. These investments send a clear message: Canada is not ceding the Arctic to anyone, not to Russia, not to China, and certainly not to an unpredictable American administration that threatens its allies. But infrastructure and military spending alone do not guarantee security. What matters equally is the network of partnerships that amplify Canadian influence and create consequences for aggression. But this is where Carney's strategic vision becomes most evident. Canada has mobilized European allies to defend not just Danish sovereignty over Greenland, but the principle that Arctic sovereignty cannot be seized through force or intimidation. On January 7th, the leaders of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom joined Denmark in issuing a joint statement defending Greenland's sovereignty. The statement was unambiguous. Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a line drawn by the world's leading democracies, making clear that Trump's threats violate fundamental principles of international order. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has stated explicitly that the Kingdom of Denmark must determine the future of Greenland and nobody else. French President Emmanuel Macron reinforced this position during his meeting with Carney in Paris. These statements matter because they transform what Trump wants to frame as a bilateral US-Denmark issue into a multilateral crisis that engages the entire Western alliance. Now let us address the argument that Trump's supporters make. They claim that Trump is simply protecting American interests in a strategically vital region, that Russia has increased its military presence in the Arctic, that China is building icebreakers and conducting research that has dual civilian and military applications, that the United States needs Greenland to counter these threats and secure critical minerals that are essential for national defense. This argument contains elements of truth but arrives at a dangerous conclusion. Yes, Russia has expanded Arctic military infrastructure and conducts regular patrols in the region. Yes, China operates 3 icebreakers and has declared itself a near-Arctic state, despite being located thousands of kilometers from the Arctic Circle. Yes, competition for Arctic resources and its shipping routes will intensify as climate change opens new economic opportunities. But here is what this argument deliberately ignores. The United States already has the Arctic presence it needs through existing agreements and infrastructure. Patuxent Space Base provides early warning capabilities. NATO partnerships provide collective security. The Ice Pact, a trilateral agreement among Canada, Finland, and the United States to build Arctic icebreakers, provides the technological capacity needed for Arctic operations. Denmark increased Arctic defense spending by $4.2 billion in October 2025, specifically to address security concerns. Canada committed $1 billion to Arctic infrastructure. These investments demonstrate that American allies are willing to shoulder the burden of Arctic defense. What Trump's threats actually accomplish is the opposite of what he claims to seek. They undermine the partnerships that make Arctic security possible. Denmark has warned that any US military action against Greenland would terminate cooperation agreements that currently allow American forces to operate on Greenlandic territory. Canada is reconsidering defense procurement decisions, including purchases of US-made F-35 fighter jets, and exploring alternative partnerships outside traditional American frameworks. European nations that had increased Arctic defense spending are now questioning whether those investments serve American interests or American aggression. Trump is not strengthening American Arctic security. He is destroying the foundation it rests upon. The cruel irony is that Trump's Greenland obsession reveals profound weakness disguised as strength. A confident superpower does not need to threaten its allies. It does not need to bribe indigenous populations. It does not need to violate international law to achieve security objectives that could be accomplished through cooperation. Trump's threats expose American isolation, not American dominance. And that isolation creates opportunities for nations like Canada that understand how power actually functions in the 21st century. Canada's Arctic strategy under Mark Carney is not defensive. It is transformative. We are not simply reacting to American threats. We are building the infrastructure, partnerships, and capabilities that will define Arctic governance for decades to come. When Governor General Mary Simon opens Canada's consulate in Nuuk this February, she will not be delivering a warning to the United States. She will be demonstrating that Canada offers Greenland and other Arctic nations something Trump never can. Partnership based on respect, Indigenous solidarity based on shared history, economic cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. This is what sovereignty looks like when it is grounded in values rather than threats. The path Canada has chosen is clear. Continue investing in Arctic infrastructure that serves both civilian and military needs. Continue building partnerships with Denmark, European allies, and Indigenous communities across the circumpolar North. Continue making it impossible for any power, including the United States, to act unilaterally in the Arctic without triggering consequences that outweigh any perceived benefits. These steps require patience and sustained commitment. But they are already producing results. Trump wanted to divide NATO. He has unified it against his threats. Trump wanted to intimidate Canada. He has mobilized Canadian investment and international support. Trump wanted to project American strength. He has exposed American recklessness. Distinguished viewers, Canada's message to Donald Trump regarding Greenland and the Arctic is simple and unambiguous. We stand with Denmark. We stand with Greenland. We stand with international law and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we will not be bullied into accepting a vision of Arctic governance based on force rather than cooperation. The Arctic belongs to its people, not to whoever has the largest military or the loudest threats. That principle is worth defending, and Canada, working with allies who share our values, will defend it. This is not the end of Arctic competition, it is the beginning of a new chapter in which Canada plays a leading role. Trump may control headlines, but Canada is building the foundations that will outlast his presidency and define the region's future. That is the difference between noise and strategy. That is the difference between threats and power. And that is the Canada that will secure the Arctic for generations to come.